The United States of America, a land full of hope, prosperity, and most importantly, freedom. A place that is a major force on the international scene and has allies in all corners of the world. At least it did after World War II, and now over the years in the Cyberpunk timeline, it has sabotaged not only its economy, it has gone to war in once allied territory and neutral zones, tried to manipulate the stock markets, assassinated anyone that spoke out against them or had different goals, and caused major damage throughout the lands. Because of all of this, during the mid to late 90s, the USA would start to see major problems. Its people would start to turn their backs on their government, and their involvement in Europe and Asia would eventually lead to what was known as the crash of '94, and then the collapse of the United States of America as we know it. But how did the USA collapse? What led to the crash of '94? And how did the USA become so disliked in the Cyberpunk universe? Well, in today's episode, we will be exploring all of that, as well as looking briefly into how the new United States of America is no better even 70 years later. So if you do enjoy the video at any point, make sure you hit that like button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't already. And with that said, let's dive into the story behind how the USA collapsed in the Cyberpunk universe. Our story starts during the latter half of the Cold War in the 1980s. During this time, the US was struggling quite a bit more than is shown in the history books. This was all because the people of America had formed a new way of thinking, where their social norms in all fields would turn into a me-first attitude, especially on the world stage, making them an enemy in the eyes of many other countries, most significantly Europe and the UK's Commonwealth allies. As the year turned to 1989, the Berlin Wall would officially come down, as the Cold War would officially come to an end, with the Soviet Union crumbling and forcing them to rethink their political system. The US wasn't much better during this time, however. They had used so many of their resources in their war to try and destroy the Soviet Union, and also got so many strongholds in Europe that their economy wasn't exactly great. Now, with all of this wrapped up, the US government looked for a new opportunity to grab some resources and funding and turn their attention to the Panama Canal, a hotspot for all trade going into the Americas. By this point in time, the treaty between multiple countries for access to it had completely run out, and because of that, this whole area went back into the ownership of the Panamanian government. I mean, after all, it was on their land. The US had other ideas about how this all worked, seeing it as a waste in the Panamanian government's hands. They decided that this was actually theirs for the taking and conducted a plan to take it for themselves. Here, the US government were going to state that this whole area was becoming a terrifying place that was a risk to national security, as it was a hotspot for tons of drug cartels who were bringing dangerous, life-threatening drugs into America's soil. This, of course, was a lie to try and get the American people to back this invasion, and it worked, sort of, as the American forces went in full throttle into the land, trying to take the Panama Canal and stick an American flag on it. Also, to take it back from the Panama president, who was an ex-US puppet dictator who had turned his back on them. That said, Panama wasn't going to be an easy place to take, as all of the countries of Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador came to their support, forming a guerrilla army taking the American troops out from the Honduran and Nicaraguan border. America didn't let that stop them, however, as they sent everything into this war, including new vehicles which charged into the forests, as well as cyber soldiers who were supposed to be walking tanks and were trained for these very situations of combating guerrilla warfare troops. At this same time, American forces were also fighting out within Iraq, sending in tons of troops, losing many in the process, and by 1991 this war would ultimately be won, but it came at a major price, as thousands of American forces would be killed in the name of freedom. Meanwhile, in Europe, they had gotten tired of this post-Cold War world, especially one where America had just started taking over any area they wanted to gain more economic power, and were paranoid that other countries were trying to take them from them. With this, in 1992, a few European countries came together and went on to form the European Economic Community, community that would also bring about a new currency they'd simply named the euro-dollar, which quickly became the official currency for many European and non-European countries. Many things were set up within the EEC that ultimately protected all of its members and to help their economies grow in these uncertain times. And because of these things put into place, many agreed to join, which included France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Benelux, which was a combination of Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, and the EEC even extended its invitation out to Japan, who accepted it, turning the yen into the euro-dollar. In terms of the United States, they weren't even considered as part of this, as many of the European nations hated the paranoid isolationist attitude that they had turned themselves into. Not only that, but these European countries would hit back against America and what they were doing on the world stage by implementing tons of tariffs that essentially wrecked the American economy, making them even more paranoid and desperate. Ultimately, the US were the only superpower to not be involved in the EEC, going to show how on their own they really were. Granted, the EEC wasn't perfect, as many protested its setup, especially in the UK, where labour rights were on the rise, but overall their economy was so much stronger than that of the US's. Not only that, but the EEC went against the US completely, as they would supply much needed food and aid to the Soviet states, who were still clinging on to some of their old ways. This act of kindness to the Soviets meant that they would actively choose to take on the euro-dollar as their main source of currency, allowing the EEC's finances to increase even more. Fuming at everything that had been happening across the pond, the US knew they had to do something to make a statement and try to prove that they were the biggest superpower in the world. Here, the group that had been behind all of the dodgy international dealings, known as the Gang of Four, who were a cabal made up of all of the heads of 4 agencies of the NSA, the CIA, the FBI and the DEA, started setting up plans to hit them hard within the stock markets in what would be named as the Quiet War. Here, the Gang of Four started to manipulate the stock markets of Europe and Asia, as they would hack directly into their systems. On top of that, the DEA would also go on to release several designer plagues worldwide, which would specifically target cacao and opium plants, which caused both the governments of Chile and Ecuador to completely collapse, and with it a major savage drug war would erupt between the Eurocorp-backed dealers and the DEA across the Americas, which was on top of their current war against the troops in the Panama Canal. This plan did not go well at all, as major protests started raging all across America, with people majorly against both of the wars, which ultimately turned into riots in all major US cities. Whilst America continued to fight against anyone that looked at them funny, the EEC began growing even further, funding a new space program which had a brand new prototype mass driver that was placed on the moon on New Year's 1993, which was the plan to essentially allow for the colonization of it. This space program would also help bolster the EEC's military, which were quickly growing stronger than anything the US had, which would make them even more fearful about their future. As the hacking of the EEC's systems was still going ahead, the stock markets were pumped with a ton of artificial currency to make it look like the US's currency was on the grow and was getting larger than Europe's. However, this was too convenient, and Europe knew this was impossible, especially with how many wars they were fighting and all of the things they had been up to. With that, the EEC launched an investigation into what was going on within the stock markets, eventually finding out that the US had indeed manipulated them, and with that information took it to the world press to show everyone how corrupt the American government was. Just before America found out about what was going on and that they had been found out, their drug wars going on within the rest of the Americas made their way into the US soil, as the Colombian drug cartels were going to set off a small tactical nuclear device in New York City that would go on to kill 15,000 innocent civilians. To add to that, with news spreading about how the stock market had been undermined by the US's actions, the whole system essentially collapsed, causing what was known as the crash of '94, where economies were crippled heavily. As a result, almost all of the developed countries of the world hit the United States with massive instituted embargoes on all of their trade, which utterly devastated America's economy. Before the crash of '94, the US's homeless population was already on the rise, as it was recorded that over 21 million people were living within tents and shantytowns. That said, the wealthy were getting richer day by day, creating a major class divide throughout all of the country. However, after the crash, the US went into a major depression, and 2 years later, in 1996, the homelessness and unemployed and international corruption reports were higher than they had ever bin. Many of the country's city governments declared outright bankruptcy, or they just completely collapsed for good. But one saving grace at this point in time was that their war in the Central American countries had come to an end. This was mainly so that the Gang of Four could get all of their troops back to the homeland and control the population there who had been rioting for many years. And rightly so, as 1 in 4 Americans were now homeless. As the country changed dramatically in just a few years, the Gang of Four was still in charge of its extremely disgruntled population. Many new communities started to form during this time, which included many nomad societies as well as the new booster gangs. With military officials everywhere on the streets, the citizens were able to stand up to their officials, as they were going to lynch hundreds of criminal defense attorneys. On the 17th of August 1996, around the time of Richard Knight's new city plans of Coronado City in California, President of the time James Richard Allen were going to be assassinated as he went around campaigning within California. Luckily for his vice president, Harold Harrison Hunt, he would take over the role of president of the USA, and with it continued the plans of the Gang of Four. The collapse got worse within the US as the military issued a full martial law in all remaining major cities, where anyone who broke curfew would be shot on sight. Houston saw the worst of this martial law as a military order given by the Gang of Four saw an artillery bombardment take place where over 2,000 citizens would be killed, naming this whole event as simply the Houston Incident. By this point in the United States, the whole government and its surrounding influences were being taken over by people wanting to control, as well as many corporate individuals, making a lot of people believe that the American government was now just a gang of thugs, as they went on to plead to their local authorities to try and stand up and protest what they were doing to their country and their states. This was also not helped with the fact that a lot of governmental individuals and powerful forces would not show up in uniform. They would all just be wearing plain clothes, meaning anyone could be grabbed and taken out if they spoke out against their superiors. With all of this happening, states started having conflicts against Washington, with many of them thinking of leaving the Union, beginning with New York and Texas, as they started to stop paying all taxes to Washington as a form of economic strike. This would then lead to the states blocking trade routes and making sure no produce was going through their borders at all, meaning Washington would lose out economically from all trade deals. This was quickly broken as a special paramilitarized police unit under the command of the Gang of Four took control of all of San Francisco, which caused tons of fights on the streets between federal forces and local residents. Calling for help, the governor here got the National Guard on their side, but the paramilitary force disguised as the federal government tried to capture the state capital, Sacramento. In response to all of this, California claims the Washington administration did not have authority over that state, and with that officially withdrew from the Union. By this point, the armed forces had regretted everything they had done for the Gang of Four and now refused to fight a lot of their battles, as they would still go on to try and take over states, believing they completely owned them. Seeing all of this, as well as the attacks that California were launching on Washington, many other states started believing that they could become free states and tried to break free from federal authority, which they were able to do as the US military had refused to fight going forward. In the year 1997, the Mid-East meltdown took place, essentially a war where nuclear weapons were set off everywhere, flattening everything in the region, turning it into essentially glass, and with it took out half of the world's oil supply. This event caused America's prices to skyrocket once again, leading to medical supplies to be limited, transportation to come to a halt, and farms and agriculture to struggle to make food going forward. Once again, this caused major panic in all of the states and cities, and with it, a gang known as the Neo-Luddites would go around bombing airports, factories, freeways, and mass transit terminals across the nation. Things didn't stop there, because the following year a massive drought would take place within the Midwest, turning tons of grassland into dead crops, once again reducing all food supply and destroying many family farms. This was then followed by an earthquake which hit Los Angeles with a strength of 10.5 on the Richter scale, which caused over 65,000 deaths and caused the Pacific Ocean to flood approximately 35% of the city. A year later, the whole world would be hit with a wasting plague that would completely destroy a person's internals, and no vaccine was publicly available to combat it for a while, leading to over 14 million deaths worldwide, until Japan finally created a suitable vaccine, saving millions of people across the world, even in America, who grabbed the vaccine despite all of the trade link problems. In terms of politics, however, the US were on their own thanks to their own actions. They had the largest homeless population probably in the world. The South American and Central American countries outright hated the American government, and now worst of all, Canada also broke free from their partnership, not wanting to have any trade deals with them anymore, and also hitting them with the same tariffs that Europe were hitting them with. The only saving grace during this whole time was that the Arasaka Corporation had started building up their offices on American soil, and because of it, Americans were starting to get jobs working for them, meaning the employment statistics were going back up for the first time in a long while. But 2000 was right around the corner, a chance to start fresh, and maybe America could be great again. But unfortunately, it was only going to get much worse from this point on. As Y2K came around the corner, a ton of millennium cults started to raise their heads, which resulted in mass orgies of self-deaths, as well as a lot of violent acts on the streets, especially on January 1st, 2000. Not the best way to enjoy the turn of the millennium. 2000 really didn't seem to be going well at all, as firestorms also started raging all over the northwestern United States, which, like with the drought 2 years prior, wiped out millions of acres of farm and grassland again, ruining their agricultural industry. Whilst all of this was going on, the Gang of Four was still in power, conducting things from within the shadows, and once again knew they needed to cause a distraction and try and grab some economic power. With that, they looked back towards Central America and invaded it once again in the year of 2003. This war was extremely familiar to the first, where Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela hit them back using guerrilla warfare. The US went into this with a lot of confidence, as they had new military units equipped with AVs to flying fast, as well as the cyber soldiers once again. To win over the general public, the Gang of Four stated this war was to once again hit back against the big drug cartels who were pumping their drugs into the US, despite the fact that the drugs that were actually being sold in the US that were providing a lot for their economy were proudly labelled as being manufactured domestically with phrases like "Buy American." Quite clearly, this was another land grab attempt to get the Panama Canal like they did in the first war. The war was a complete and utter failure once again, as many soldiers were being sent into their deaths, essentially with no land being taken at all. But somehow, this whole battle turned into a 7-year slog, with endless bloodbaths happening as the Gang of Four looked for something to change. Back at home, new elections were coming up, and it was a chance for the US people to stand up for democracy and vote a new leader in. However, this would come to a major halt as presidential appointee Henry Jacoby would be assassinated. The assassination was said to be done by the corporation known as Mantoga Inc., and because of it, this corporation was given 4 hours to completely leave the United States, and as they refused to do it, the US military went in and destroyed all of them in what was named as Operation Big Stick, as well as the Mantoga incident, which happened on the 17th of November 2005. 3 years after this incident, the United States was going back to a form of normality. The Second Central American War alerted everyone to how corrupt the Gang of Four were, and because of it, they were quickly losing power and trust in their people, especially as the war was costing them day in and day out. Because of this, the other government figures started to clear them out of office, introducing a ton of new reforms that were passed by the new Congress. The war still went on in the background as all of this was going on, but most importantly, the Gang of Four had been wiped out, or at least that's what many thought. In fact, a lot of the agents of the gang had merged into many of the mega corporations from around the world, showing that they will always be playing a part in international policies and business. By 2008, however, the US were able to have free elections once again, and with it, martial law was officially lifted, meaning safety for those in the major cities who wanted to go out once again. That said, it didn't take too long before more international problems happened, as the USSR accused the US of utilizing biological warfare. This angered the US, as they would go on to try and hit the Soviet state in a way they had wanted to do for years during the Cold War, as they went on to assault the Soviet weapons platform known as the Mir-13. Europe didn't hold back here, however, as they would get their European Space Agency to get involved, which resulted in a 6-hour orbital war between the Euros and the Yanks. As a result of it, however, Colorado Springs would ultimately be destroyed, as a rock would be launched from the Titro mass driver and would land straight on the city, causing an end to the war, but then led to even more uneasy peace to last for many years to come. More space battles happened in 2009 as US-backed terrorists tried to take over the Crystal Palace space station, but they would be caught pretty quickly by the ESA as they would follow it up by dropping yet another orbital rock off the coast of Washington as a warning to stop any future attacks. By 2010, the Second Central American War officially came to an end. However, the government decided it only had enough funds to bring back the vital equipment and high-ranking officers, meaning all of the lower-ranking soldiers would be cut from their service, dismissed, and left out there within whatever country they were fighting within. The way the government got around this was by stating they had turned their backs on their country and refused to fight for them, trying to get everyone at home to name them as deserters, which many of the population actually believed. With that news being told to the abandoned soldiers, a lot of them turned into nomads, stole a ton of military equipment, and set themselves up in their own unique society they'd name as Metaki, refusing to take the US government seriously and making sure none of their taxes went to them. Back at home, however, more and more states were getting fed up with Washington's rule, even though the Gang of Four was now gone from the office. With it, many joined California and became free states, deciding their own fate for themselves and not worrying about having to pay taxes to the federal government. The whole atmosphere of the United States had completely shifted. States were all on their own, but considering what happened during the collapse, this seemed like a much better option for them, especially in the long run. As the US entered the 2020s, the whole world would be plunged into the fourth corporate war, and for the people of America, they would be hit harder than anyone had ever been hit before. The collapse absolutely devastated their homes and everything around them, with many deaths as well, but this period in time killed over 100 million Americans in just 15 years, and most of these deaths were caused by a lack of communication between the states. If they had talked to each other and shared their hoarded resources and munitions, millions of deaths could have been prevented. As the war got even more heated, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Night City were seeing massive battles rage through the streets, making it look like the cities were permanently on fire, and the sound of automatic weapons would ring out all day and night, as they all needed some form of assistance, even if that were by the federal government. They had to do something. Luckily for them, National and State Guard units were put on high alert all across the nation, with even low Earth orbit patrols being a daily occurrence, to make sure their territory was protected from these corporations. By 2022, the end of the war was coming, as the governments of South California and the Republic of Texas had had enough, and went on to nationalize both the Arasaka and Militech facilities within their border. This led Europe to follow suit, as they would also nationalize all of the corporation's facilities, and with that done, the war was pretty much over, apart from within Night City, where the fighting continued on with no real end in sight. This would of course lead to the Night City Holocaust, where a secret Militech team would invade the Arasaka Tower and set off tactical nukes that wiped out the tower and turned the whole of the city centre into rubble, killing 12,000 workers in the process and many in the surrounding area. This whole attack was ultimately planned by the US president of the time, Elizabeth Kress, who was once a Militech president, and with it as a success, or at least over, she would go on a massive PR campaign to make it clear that the ones to blame for the Night City Holocaust was Arasaka, who were using a nuclear device in the tower as a failsafe to protect their assets, and when they realized they couldn't defeat the vastly superior Militech force, they set it off, triggering disaster all over Night City and devastating North America as well. With the fourth corporate hot war now over, Militech became fully nationalized and brought into the US National Forces to help bolster them for if anything else were to happen. But with it all wrapped up, the United States had officially run its course. It was not labeled as a superpower anymore, and now it was just run under the dictatorship of President Kress, who had been holding office since the state of emergency was issued during the height of the Fourth Corporate War. Because of this war, local elections were not allowed just simply because it would have been far too difficult to organize, and now was not a good time, especially with gunfire happening on a regular basis and bombs going off every 5 seconds. On top of that, because of all the free states claiming independence, the top dogs in Washington agreed there shouldn't be any more elections until the country was united once again. Seeing that this was the state of the country, it would rename itself simply the new United States of America and would run things very very differently now. The military would now be organized into Combined Operation Groups, or COGs, which were essentially task forces combining aircraft, ships, infantry and armor, and their main missions was to take out anyone that was a threat to the federal government and to the Bosporus corridor. Alongside that, the NUSA became similar in style to the way it was back in the late 19th century, where the federal government ruled the country from Washington and controlled the civilized East Coast, whereas just west of the Mississippi River, this would be where the Wild West would be, the lawless lands that needed civilizing as they were not listening to the federal government's rule. And finally, there was the Pacifica Confederation, which was on the west coast, which consisted of Northern California, British Columbia, Oregon, Washington and Idaho. And by the year 2045, this is how America became what it is today. Years and years of hardship, death and destruction has turned them into a country where their neighbors could be their greatest enemy, depending on what state they are a part of. International relations are still at an all-time low, and the NUSA government still has that paranoid view on the world. President Kress would rule over the NUSA for years, making plans to try and bring all of the states together again and to make them a superpower, but she would never act on it. It would only be when President Rosalind Myers, a Militech CEO, took over from Kress in 2065 where action would be taken, as Myers would trigger the Unification War to try and bring all of the states together like Kress had planned, but she would do this with as much force as possible, almost leveling some of the free states until they caved in and joined up. In the end, however, it would be Night City and the Republic of Texas who would stand their ground, and thanks to the help of Arasaka, the war would come to an end, and some of the free states went back to living for themselves, and Night City would be officially listed as an international city, free from any North American government interfering with their business. For a time, it looked like this was it for the NUSA. It was still going to be the federal government and the free states making up the country, constantly watching to make sure neither of them do anything. However, it's quite clear that with Rosalind Myers in the seat of the White House, anything could happen. Countries could be taken by her, states could be invaded without warning, mega corporations could do her bidding, and those working under her will would do anything she wants or suffer the biggest consequences. The United States of the post-World War II era had gone. It was never going to be that great superpower that everyone idolized and feared, and whilst things were looking better for them as a country, as people had food and jobs throughout all of the states, they are still one of the most devastated countries thanks to the Unification War, the Fourth Corporate War, and even the collapse, which happened almost 80 years prior. It's unsure if they will ever get back to being that dominant country again, but even with Myers out of the way, a new leader could take them into an even more dubious future, especially if they have links with the megacorps who are renowned for doing anything to boost their growth. And on top of that, how are the other countries ever going to trust this country ever again? But until we know more, this has been the full story of how the USA officially collapsed and how it formed into the weaker, permanently at each other's throats country of the NUSA. A big thanks for watching this video, and like always, do let me know what other topics you'd like to see covered at a later date. A big shout out to my patrons for the endless support they've been giving me over the years, such as my small fishes, my big fishes, Nox Fox, Ben Chance and Jono, my YouTube channel Wise One, Sith Lord 906, Video Gamer 75 and Planet Non-Ontarium, my Shark Jason X117, my Megalodon Sinus and Hazy Thoughts, and my incredible Starfish Nanohertz. But that is all for now. Thank you for watching once again, and I shall see you all in the next one. Cheers.